let's start with something simple. About 20 odd years ago, it may be slightly longer than that, I was invited to a meeting at the DWP, or what was the Employment Service, to talk about an assessment centre they wanted us to design, with a special emphasis on diversity and equal opportunities, which is one of our research areas. And Roger and I, one of the other psychologists here, went to this event in London, and I'd spent weeks before putting together a PowerPoint presentation about all the diversity aspects, how you make cut-off scores and make sure they don't have a negative impact against any of the population that would be going through this assessment centre process that we were going to put together for them. And we were in there for about just over an hour, and I thought the meeting had gone really well. I mean, they were attentive, they were engaged with everything we talked about, they liked the research we'd done in the area. I thought we'd nailed it. And I came out, and I remember saying to Roger, that went well. And he looked at me and said, did it? I went, yeah. And I gave him all the action points that I thought had gone over really well. And he said, yeah. He said, they just said it was interesting. I was like, oh. And it kind of took me back a bit, really. I was like, oh. And then a couple of months later, I was doing another presentation, this time to a different government agency, to the Planning Inspectorate, with a colleague of mine called Peter. And I thought he was putting together the presentation, because he was based in the north of the country, and he thought I was going to put the final points to it. The long and short of it was, we met up in Paddington, and we were getting the train to Bristol, where the main offices of the Planning Inspectorate were. And we sat on that train, and we had to rapidly put together the presentation for this meeting that we were going to have about doing a 3-year leadership development program. And back in the day, we didn't have PowerPoint, we just had acetates. I don't know if you remember those, like plastic sheets, and we were just literally scribbling out what this leadership development program was going to be about, and how it was. We designed it, but we actually hadn't put the if you like, the spin on it for this meeting. And we went in there, and we were up against some really big consultancies: Accenture, PwC, SHL, and we sat out and we saw these people that looked really corporate, and there's us. And I said to Peter, I said, oh, I'm not sure about this. And he went, oh, he said, we're here now, let's do it. So we went in there, and I was really nervous. I was stumbling over words. And we had these acetates that were literally just handwritten notes and ideas on. Anyway, 2 months later, we hear nothing. And I had walked out of this meeting going to Peter, oh, that's not going to happen, is it? So I'd sort of dismissed it. And 2 months later, I get a phone call. Well, I didn't get the phone call. We got a phone call saying, we'd like you to accept, we accept your tender, basically, and we want to work with you. And it was just like, well, how does that work? You know, earlier on in the year, had a really good meeting, thought it was going well. 6 months later, similar sort of thing, but just didn't think it was going to connect. I mean, you know, that moment where where you think you walk out the meeting and you think it's landed and it just hasn't. I mean, I expect you've all had those meetings. And I think the issue here, therefore, is what we now recognise as called the influence gap. That difference between what we intend to happen and actually what is experienced by the people in our audience. So what we think is going on and what they think is going on, and it can be quite different. And whilst I've started with those sort of perhaps two anecdotes that perhaps don't put me in the best light, it's not just based on anecdotal evidence. Actually, there's lots of behavioural data out there, and I pulled up 6,000 leaders. And the pattern that you see in these leaders is consistent. So these leaders are from different regions of the world. They're in different organizations, but the majority of them in this leadership sample actually are mid-career and senior executives. And I guess what matters is not actually the distribution, but what actually happens to these leaders in terms of how they influence in their career. And so when you start looking at the data in a bit more detail, just hold on a minute, I'm just going to let somebody else in. When you start looking at the data in a bit more detail, what you see is actually something quite different. And that is that senior leaders tend to get less adaptable as they get more resilient, and they get more resilient. When I say senior leaders, I'm talking about people who are in senior positions in organizations in their late 40s going up into their 60s. Mid-career leaders tend to be more stable but slow to make decisions. Early leaders struggle to drive influence. And you can see that by looking at these areas that we measure. So here is this grey line is the influence, and you can see, right, it's right low here, and then it slowly creeps up as you get higher into their career, right into the late career. Then when what the sample is called other people, that's dropped off again. So, and if you look at the others, you can see the same thing happening. What's interesting is that idea that influence, or that drive to influence, increases as people go through their leadership pathway. Now, you may say, well, okay, but is that experience or is that something about them? Well, when you start then examining it in a bit more detail, you can start looking at, say, leadership style, and then you can see, well, that changes with leadership experience. And I've made it slightly simpler on this graph. So you can see here that early career leaders, in the blue, are very low on what we call visionary style. They get slightly better on coaching, but actually early leaders, early career leaders, so these are people in their sort of 30s, just starting their leadership pathway. They rely on sort of democratic leadership, not so great on pace setting. But if you then compare it, say, to the senior or late career, you're getting a totally different look. They're much more into visionary, showing what things are going on, but what's the future for the organization. And then, but what's also interesting is that they've got this big pace setting, which is about drive. Not so much in the sort of democratic. So they're not interested in sort of consensual leadership. They're more interested in getting things done and moving things forward. And they say, okay, well, how does that apply to influence? Well, if we then look at this in terms of influence, then you get a totally different understanding. So what you see here is style doesn't mean influence, because if you look at here, so again, if I just pick on the senior and late career leaders, they are very driver orientated in terms of their influencing style, which means is they want to get a result, they want to push to get their influence across. But the analyst, which is about evidence, is very low. So what you see here is that they're very driven. They tend to nurture their relationships. They like to be quite organized in the way they influence people. They like to have some connection, but then that's not so clear. But actually, the evidence isn't so important. Whereas if you compare that to a mid-career leader and how they influence, they're not interested in pushing results. They're much more around, well, what's the evidence for this? Do I have a relationship with this person? What's the what's the plan for this? And then if you look at the early career, they're very different. They're not very strong on influence at all. They're actually quite low. They're not about pushing over the line at all. And what's important for them, again, compared to, say, the senior, is the evidence. How do they influence through evidence, this analyst idea. So very different pathways you're beginning to see depending on the experience of the leader and where they're perhaps operating in the organizations that this data is collected from. So why, if you go back to the anecdotes that I told you, why doesn't leadership influence always land? Well, it's not just our data. If you look, there's quite a lot of research out there. Research shows that leaders consistently overestimate their effectiveness. And this is more as they become senior, the bigger this gap seems to become. So you can see here, I'm just putting some of the research up as we speak. So what this means is that the way leaders experience a moment isn't necessarily the same as other people experience it. It's quite different. And so therefore, it's what I would argue is called the leadership shift. Whereas leadership failure often isn't about skill or knowledge. It's about misreading the situation and the impact.
Stephen, sorry to interject. Are we going to have access to these slides?
Probably. I can get them into a PDF and send them over for people to look at, definitely.
Fantastic. Thanks. Sorry to interject.
Yeah. So the challenge is that the common assumption is that successful leadership is about capability. But in many cases, that's not true. It's about misjudging the situation or not understanding the situation and their impact. And the research and our data is really strongly says that's the case. So therefore, why are all our development processes, or a lot of them, about building capability? And I suppose when I start looking at it, I start thinking about it slightly differently. I start thinking about, well, what actually shapes leadership impact? How is that? How do we get people to behave differently? And I guess this is a bit where business EQ comes in, which is about how our emotional behavior shape how we land and communicate. So this model that I put up here sort of gives an idea of how we see leaders learning to have better impact than they are already. So our emotional behavior shapes how we land and communicate. And you can see that by this idea of the leadership compass, which is about what are the leadership styles that they use, what are they comfortable with, and then how do those leadership styles impact our influence, or how does our influence soften or amplify those leadership styles so we actually have the leadership impact that we want, or people experience our leadership in the way that we want them to experience it. And it's really breaking it down from the internal, what's going on internally, how do we manage our emotional behaviors, how do we understand them, to how does that project onto our leadership style, what kind of leadership style are we most comfortable with, how do we use that, and then how do we manifest that in the way we communicate, in the conversations we have, to influence others so they experience the leadership or the impact that we want them to have. I think the key point about this is that most leaders, and I guess we do have a slightly biased sample because we're normally brought into organizations when there's a problem and not when there's a success. Most leaders who we come into contact with don't understand that dynamic. They don't understand the levers they need to pull to improve their success in the workplace. And that seems relatively straightforward, but there's another layer to this that actually makes it absolutely critical, which is how leadership impact varies depends on what we call our meta traits or the calibration layer. So the key piece that most tools miss out on is not just understanding the emotional behaviors and how they operate and how that they're affected by context. So when we're stressed, how we behave compared to when we're in a nice, comfortable position, how that then manifests in terms of the leadership styles that we present and feel most comfortable leading to. Are we more visionary, or are we more coaching, or are we more commanding or pace setting? And then how does that come across? How do we communicate that to people in terms of the influencing approach that we take? And that seems relatively straightforward, but the calibration layer, which is the bit that's really important, is that self-awareness piece. How aware are we of these emotional behaviors and how they affect us and affect the people around us? And more importantly, this piece about impression management. So we all have a drive to manage our impressions, to manage the way that we come across to people. I'm doing it now. As I speak, I'm conscious, I'm thinking about all the time, have I been speaking too long? Have I got your attention? How do I need to? That's a conscious drive, but there's also an unconscious drive that we all have, which is about how we project ourselves. And in certain critical situations, that becomes stronger. So that critical factor of what I say, the meta traits or the calibration layer, is the key thing that makes leaders become successful. Not how accurate are they? How much understanding do they have of how their emotional behaviors impact themselves and others? And leadership fails at that calibration layer. And I'm not saying that once you're self-aware, you've always got that level of insight, because you haven't, because self-awareness is very fluid. We all can be in states where we're very aware of our emotional behaviors, and there's other times when we're not. So it's not, oh, once you become self-aware, that's it. It's about recognizing the time when you need to be more self-aware to have the best impact you can. And I think there's a bit there that isn't in the model, which is context. So I talk about the self-awareness in terms of accuracy of understanding yourself and understanding other people, that interpersonal piece. And then how does that impact by your desire to create the right impression or manage yourselves appropriately for the situational context you find yourself in? But the other bit around that is that context. So what are the power dynamics going on? How much stress are you under? Is it an ambiguous situation, or is it very clear? What levels of trust do you have because you know the people that you're managing and leading against working with the new team? So there's lots of context that sits around that also affects our emotional behaviors. But when calibration breaks down, it's very easy to see predictable patterns. And I'll just bring this slide up, because I think this is a really interesting bit, because it's not because they lack ability, it's because they overuse or undersell their strengths. So I won't go through all of them, but there's the one that I find interesting. I know I've talked to Barry about this before. Is this dark triad operator, where people are high in self-awareness. So they really understand themselves. They understand their emotional behaviors, but they've got high impression management as well. So in other words, they're very keen to present a way of behaving that suits the environment or the context they're operating in. And Hogan, in their personality assessment, kind of talks about this as like the dark side, but they assume that people aren't aware of that sort of Machiavellian behavior. And what we see in our data is actually people can be aware and still operate that way. And so what you find is that when they're high in both these and their value system is about this, then they use their insight, that self-awareness and their understanding of others to manipulate or gain control. And of course, that's really dangerous because it's basically they're prioritizing manipulation over connection because they just want to get the people to behave in a way that makes them feel better. So therefore you get toxic environments, you get hidden agendas. You know, you've all, I'm sure, worked in organizations or been called into organizations where you've seen these environments, these toxic environments. Now, it may not be a dark, what we call a dark triad operator, you know, in the extreme sense as we described there, but I'm sure you'll see that. And the reason you're seeing that is because the people there are driven to deliver something in a way that suits them rather than the people they're working with. And it's probably because they're not very high in self-awareness. They don't realize they have their impact they're having. So I guess what I'm trying to get across here is that leadership impact isn't what you do, it's about how it's experienced by others. And I think that's the key message. And so if you amplify this, it's about how do you get people or leaders to understand that it isn't just about, oh, this is how you behave. It's about how you communicate that. How do you get people to think about the impact they're having on other people? And I think that's the challenge. Because the more senior you get, the less feedback you tend to receive. Many leaders, in my experience, and I'm happy to look at the chat and see whether you agree with it, don't seem to have the clear visibility of how they land with others. They're so wrapped up in doing what they need to deliver, they don't think about that connection. They don't think about how they're influencing and how they're impacting others. I guess this is where business EQ becomes practical, because it's about how do you make that visible to other people? So how do you translate those emotional behaviors into something observable? And that's where the assessment that we use is really practical, because it starts talking about, well, how do you make decisions? How do you motivate? How do you influence? And I showed you that data earlier on about how that influence, that drive to influence, changes over a career. But it's how it's experienced by others that makes it the difference. That's what the assessment tells you. And what happens when your emotions hijack you? What happens when you suddenly find that you're making quicker decisions than before? But the key to this, and this is what we're discovering more and more, is the meta traits. It's about making people recognize when they need to focus on their self-awareness and when do they need to be more aware of the impression they're creating or they're trying to create. So are they only presenting at junior level? Are they only presenting what people want to hear? And I guess that also ties in to things like psychological safety, doesn't it? But we've all got that drive to impression management. I don't want you to think it's just leaders. You know, we all do it to a lesser or more degree. And the great thing about the EBW is that it actually benchmarks that. So then what do we do with this, you know, with this diagnostic? Well, the next thing is to then say, well, let's have a look at the leadership styles. And so how do your emotional behaviors, how do they connect to the way you like to lead? And the great thing about the leadership styles piece is it gives you a clear view of how you lead in practice and where you're going to struggle. So are you more visionary than commanding? Are you more pace setting than you are affiliate? And if you remember back from the original data, you can see in certain levels of organizations, leadership tends to focus on certain leadership styles. That doesn't mean, I'm not saying just because our data shows that a lot of senior people tend to be visionary and tend to be very driven in the way they influence and very focused on delivering their ideas, so they're not very affiliative in the way they lead. That doesn't mean to say that isn't the right style of leadership. That may absolutely be the right style of leadership and have the right impact. I'm not saying that one's right or wrong. I'm just saying this is what the data shows us. I think there's the interesting bit there is that when you look at the sort of broader data out there, when you look at, say, the generational differences, what you see in the younger generation, I'm at that age now where I can talk about the younger generation, is that they're complaining they don't like our leaders. They're saying they're not nurturing enough. They're not bringing them on. They're not connecting with them. They don't have the same values. So maybe our data that I'm showing you shows, yes, these are the leadership styles that aren't working. I think you have to take it by case basis. I'm not, these are broad trends, broad patterns. But what it does, it gives you an insight and a way of benchmarking and then a challenge for those leaders. And then when you move it on, you can then start looking at where influence succeeds or fails. And that's where we start looking at different influencing styles. So how do these influencing styles, how we like to influence, how we like to communicate, how do they amplify or soften the way we lead? So I was doing some work with a senior executive a couple of weeks ago, and it was really interesting because a bit like the description of the data, when we looked at her leadership styles, she was high on visionary. Yeah. She was affiliative. She was coaching. She wasn't very democratic. That wasn't as high, but she was that people style of leadership, and that was her values, and that's what she believed in. She wanted to bring people on. And then we looked at her influencing drivers. How did she like to influence? She was a driver. Yeah. So she liked to, get results out of her conversations, have a very clear direction of how she influenced. She was a connector. She liked to have lots of people that she could talk to. But she was also a nurturer. So she wasn't like, oh, I just connect to loads of people. She wanted to genuinely understand those people. The steward part of it, which was about connection, about keeping things going and keeping a sort of a process in the way she influenced, wasn't so clear. She was a bit all over the place in some respects. She was very much living by her impulses in terms of the way she influenced. But what was also opposite to the data that I showed you earlier was that she was very analytical. And so when I started talking to her about it, I said, well, how does that work for you? Your leadership styles are saying you're very people orientated, you're visionary, you're coaching. And she said, yeah, she said, I'm often brought in to organizations when they're in an absolute crap show. They're having real problems, and I'm brought in to sort them out. And she said, for the first eight months, they love me. She said, because I come in there and I'm people, I'm oriented, She said, but when I ask them to step up, that's when it starts going wrong. And I'm like, well, how does that work? What do you think's going on there? Because, you get people orientated. Yeah, she said, but what I've discovered, and she said what these reports make clear to me, is that I'm very good at getting alignment early on. But I've already solved the problem. I've already got the evidence in my head. I've already had all the arguments. I've thought everything out. So she said, I can go in, I can be all people orientated, and I get things to happen quickly because I've already got all the evidence there. What happens is 8 months later, she said, when they don't start producing in the way I expect, and I'm saying, but why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing this? And why aren't you doing this? Suddenly, my people style of leadership changes. And this is what we saw. She said, then I become much more task focused, much more evidence led, and my influence is much more about, well, what are you doing? Have you done this? Where's the evidence for that? You agreed to do this. And then suddenly everything changes. She said, and I have to work really hard at doing that softer piece. She said, and it's there. I believe that's how I should be leading. She said, but when I communicate, she said, that's the analytical side, the driver side takes over because I need to get results done. And they're not, in her words, they're not delivering what we agreed to. My question for her was, how did she know there was agreement in the first place? Yes, she talks about, but if she's communicating at pace, she's already done all the argument, she's already sifted through the direction, she's got the vision, maybe she's just snowballing that, and what she thinks is alignment is just people just agreeing because she's a force of power. So I think that's where, when you see that idea of like the emotional behaviors, you've got your leadership styles, you've got your influences, and then the calibration layer, the meta traits, that's when it starts becoming insightful. That's when you can start saying, well, what motivates people? How do you motivate them to change? How's it going to make a difference? And that's one of the biggest challenges, I think, for organizations and for people who go into for transformations, is insight, I guess, doesn't always lead to change. So you've got to move from that awareness to understanding to behavioral change. And the question is, how do you do that? And one of the problems I see out there is that a lot of organizations still use personality assessments. And personality assessments are great for saying, this is how you are. The problem with them is they tend to label you. So, you're either, if you use something like some of the color ones, you're red or you're green, and they don't sell the fact that you can change. And we know through neuroscience now that actually the way we behave is very much changeable. So traits that we thought were much more stable are actually a lot more flexible. And that means that when we're working with leaders, teams, organizations, and talking about transformational change, talking about how you change your emotional behavior, it's not just about providing them with insights. It's about thinking about how do you motivate these people to make it worth their while to change, to continue to build on that insight and do something with it. So there's two things that you need to think about. You need to think about them having the insight and benchmarking them using the EBW. But the other important bit is that insight has to motivate them to want to behave, to manage, to lead differently. You can't just say, oh, you're like this. That doesn't provide the insight. That doesn't provide the change that I say. So with the EBW, what we've got is with the influence report, which I've just talked about, those different styles of influence, that's kind of a light entry. It gives you some ideas of, well, how do you communicate? How do you talk to people? How do you have impact? And then if you want more deeper development, you can use the leadership styles. And then the diagnostic, the bit that sits underneath that, is a business EQ piece. So you've got different ways of getting people to understand how they motivate others. How do they change the way they influence? How do they change their impact? And that's what the leadership shift is all about. It's about the fact that most leaders, in my experience, don't lack skills or knowledge. In actual fact, in a lot of organizations, leaders are recruited, are promoted based on their knowledge and skills. But what they do is they lack visibility about how they land. And I guess without that visibility and without the methods or the understanding about what limits their impacts and what they need to do to change them, then they're not going to transform the organizations in the way they're expected to do today. they've got to start thinking about how they have impact. I know I've talked at pace so far, and I've gone through quite a lot of different concepts at quite rapid pace. I hope I've kept everybody engaged. So what are your next options? What are your next steps? So there's a couple of options. You can start by piloting the EBW assessment, and if you're interested in doing that, then please put your either email, connect to me directly in the chat and give me your email, or if you're happy for other people on the call to see your email, then just put it in the chat, and I'll get our team here to send you out an email with some codes. You can start by building capability. You can, have a look at our EBW certification, so you can start looking at the different ways that you can use the assessments and all the tools and the workshops and the programs that we have. Or you can talk to an EBW assessment partner. There's a few EBW assessment partners on the call today, and they will help you address your challenges. I think if you're happy, I'll leave you one final question. How does your leadership actually land? Or more importantly, how do you know how your leadership is landing? Thank you very much. If you've got any questions, I'll be on the call for another 5 minutes or so. Happy to answer any.
Stephen, could I ask a question? Thank you, Stephen. That was terrific. You rightly commented, and we've had a couple of conversations on this before. Can I ask you where the 5 categories of influence came from? The driver, nurturer, stewards, connector, analyst. Yep. Where did those 5 categories come from, and why were they chosen?
Yeah, so that they came out of, there's a couple of places they came out of literature review. So when we started looking at the literature, what were the influencing styles that you tend to see out there? How do people influence? So that was the main driver for that. And then they also came out of a data analysis that we did looking at the emotional behaviors that we already measure within the EBW assessment system. But the driver for that approach was the literature review. So I don't think and I think we've had this conversation before, Barry, I don't think they're necessarily any different from perhaps other influencing models that you see out there. We just name them slightly differently to what, say for example, the driver and the connector might be seen as a hunter in sort of traditional sales literature. We split them up. We're much more interested in the nuances of how people influence. And I think the key thing to remember with those influencing styles, it's not that you just have one, it's about understanding the pattern of those influencing styles, and also what happens when you're under load. Where do you default to? How do you influence? In the same way as how do you lead? What behaviors do you show when you're under load? And therefore, how do you communicate when you're low? So there's 2 different dynamics going on that are important for understanding how we have impact.
Stephen, thanks very much. That was fabulous. And sorry, I was by phone because I was driving, and then but couldn't work the technology. Particularly, and you raised it. I heard you raise it about different generations, and obviously there's a lot of studies around different generations.
Yeah.
What advice would you give where you got, the millennials, Gen Z, around how things land, how your leadership style actually lands? Because they clearly want very different things to say.
I think you have to start with the conversation. Unfortunately, for many leaders who don't feel they've got the time, but if you want to have better impact, you have to talk to people. You have to understand what their approach is, what they're excited about, what drives them, and that means having conversations and not assuming that the way you lived your life at that age is going to be the way that they're living their life. The world is very different. Even in the last 15 years, it's changed dramatically. I always use the example of the mobile phone. The iPhone came out in 2007. That's in the last 19 years that we've had technology that was first seen on, for those who were that generation, on Star Trek. You know, we had the flip up screen and you could suddenly, you know, see someone. That's for us is only in the last, as I say, 19 years. But for the younger generation, that's all they've known. So the way you communicate with them, the way you talk to them is going to have to be very different, because they're going to have different values and different experiences to the ones that us as older leaders, if I can use that word, older, hate it, experience the world.
Thank you, that's helpful. Just if I could just add something else, a course I was doing last year put forward some research that suggested that those millennials and Gen Z, I think particularly, our older generations, you say, go an inch wide and go a mile deep with our view of things, and the younger generation simply go an inch deep and a mile wide. I thought that was quite helpful in a bit of understanding, and it's over the last few months it's helped quite dramatically. So I just thought I'd raise that.
Have you found that helped just in your conversations with
It
younger people
absolutely
in the team?
tremendously. I'd never ever thought of it that way. That actually, you know, the things they do and their interests, etc., will be a mile wide and an inch deep, whereas it seems to be the older, more mature individual tends to look at everything in great detail. But
any mature individuals on the call want to suggest that they do act that way? Just curious. Any other questions? Well, listen, thank you very much then for joining me today. I hope you found it useful. Look out for our next one. I think the next one's going to be around teams.